Okay, today, well, welcome to the first of the videos online for SLP 601, Research in Speech Language Pathology. And I'm going to pick up today from where I left off when we were together for our face-to-face sessions and just review a little bit the idea of independent and dependent variables as a component of all research and how they're operationalized. Part of what you need to, really the first thing you really need to do to understand an article, a research article that you're reading, you have to really understand what are the variables that they are evaluating. What about this, how are they operationalizing these variables? What about this study, what terms tend to be theoretical in nature, and what terms are observable and measurable things that stand for the theoretical constructs, concepts, or propositions. And then you ask yourself, do I buy into this? Do I buy into this theory? Are these observable, measurable behaviors reasonable instances of the concepts or in constructs and theory-based propositions that are being proposed? And if the research is clinical research, then is the independent and dependent variable relationship, that is the treatment and its outcome, is this applicable to my clinical work, and is there evidence here that's to support its use and its efficacy? That is, that the intervention procedure, the treatment that's being evaluated, actually has an effect on the behavior that you're trying to target in the course of intervention with the particular population you're working with. That's the question. Now, I'm going to turn to one of the articles that one of the teams that you were part of during our last session. Remember, you had grouped and looked at some articles that I brought in these hard copies of text hard copies. I'm going to look at one of those articles just to review the dependent independent variable thing, operationalizing variables, and then I'm going to move on and talk about three types of research: structural research or research design, structural research, experimental research, and quasi-experimental research. I'm actually not only going to be speaking about design, but what the objectives really of each type of research are, what the objectives are, and ultimately, what are the nature of the dependent and independent variables in each? That's where we're headed. But first, I'm going to speak about an article, and the article is in the hard copy of the journals. The article is called "The Argument Structure Complexity Effect in Children with Specific Language Impairment: Evidence from the Use of Grammatical Morphemes in French" by Pizzioli and Shellstrite. Now again, I have a hard copy here, but I'm going to be speaking over excerpts from an electronic copy. Now, where did I get that electronic copy? I got it from the American Speech, Language, and Hearing Association online website, asha.org. I'm a member, and I went into the website, clicked on publications, identified this particular publication among every publication that exists in the world of speech pathology from the very beginning, because ASHA makes all publications available to us. So that's what I did, and I strongly recommend that you become a member of ASHA as a student. So you would become a member actually of the National Student Speech, Language, and Hearing Association, and you would then have access to all research in the field. Speaking now over a paragraph that I pulled out of the, I believe it's from towards the end of the literature review section, and it states the following: as already stated previously, the first aim of the present study was to test whether children with SLI are limited in linguistic processing capacities compared to language-matched peers by looking at the effects of argument complexity on the omission of grammatical morphemes in sentence production with transitive and intransitive verbs. Now, let's just stop there for a second. That's one of the purposes or aims of the study. They are looking at the effects of argument complexity on the omission of grammatical morphemes in sentence production with transitive and intransitive verbs among children with SLI compared with typically achieving children. Based on that sentence and that sentence alone, what is the dependent variable? What is the independent variable? Let's do that first, and then dependent. Do you remember what the term independent variable refers to? Yeah, it refers to the cause in a cause-effect relationship, and again, research is always exploring relationships between things, between variables. So in this statement, it says the effects of argument complexity. So effect means to effect, that is to have an influence on something. So argument complexity, whatever that means, argument complexity is the independent variable here. And what's it affecting? The omission of grammatical morphemes in sentence production with transitive and intransitive verbs. That is it's going to affect the children's omissions of morphemes in sentence production. So the omission of grammatical morphemes is the dependent variable. It's the effect of argument complexity on the omission of grammatical morphemes. That's what's being studied. Now remember when I was quote-unquote grilling you a few sessions ago, last session actually, by grilling I hope you meant, as you characterized my interactions with you, I hope you saw that really what I was trying to do is get you to separate out these variables and to focus on, be able to focus on independent and to be able to focus on dependent, first of all separately, and then bring them together so you distinguish between things. It's very important to distinguish. So separating them out again, independent variable is argument complexity of sentences. Dependent variable is the omission of grammatical morphemes in the production of sentences. Now, let's ask ourselves, are there any terms here that tend to be theoretical and not directly observable? And there certainly are. There certainly are. The one that jumps out, at least at me, is the term argument complexity. I need to know, I really don't understand just from looking at that term exactly what they mean by that. What is argument complexity to these people? So let's see if we could find out how they operationalize this term, how they define the term, both conceptually and operationally. Now again, remember what the term operational means. It means making something conceptual, that is, that's in one's mind, a way of an idea, making an idea observable and measurable, translating an idea into a particular behavior. So let's take a look if we could identify someplace in this article that does this. Well, there's this heading called Argument Structure Complexity that I've copied out along with a statement, and this is the author's definition of argument structure complexity. Sentences, they write, sentences vary in argument complexity. Intransitive verbs, or one-place argument structures, require only one argument in the subject position. Now, even to understand this, before you read the next part of the sentence, you might ask yourself, you may have to ask yourself, what do they mean by the word argument? Argument. Now, they don't define that specifically here. They presume either the reader understands this or can infer this from the context. And it says one argument in subject position. That means subject of the verb or the complement of a verb. Remember in the other course, if you're taking 602 acquisition with me, we're busy in single verb sentences identifying SVC and talking about verb relation content categories. That's because verbs have subjects and complements as arguments, and that makes for a nice relationship, SVC relationship. Well, they're talking about the same thing here, really. Argument structure. Now, intransitive verbs do not take a direct object, and a direct object is a noun as an object. A intransitive verb does not take a noun after it without some help from a preposition or something. So the sentence Donald runs is intransitive because runs takes a noun subject. All subjects are nouns. Donald, it takes Donald for a subject, but you cannot put a noun after it. Donald runs, except for one noun. You can put one noun after the word runs. Home. You can say Donald runs home. But try something else. Donald runs school. No, you have to say to school. Donald runs to the park. Can you say Donald runs park? No, you have to say to the park. Therefore, runs is intransitive. It only takes a subject. It does not take a noun for a complement. We will get into that business in the other course, acquisition. Now, transitive verbs take minimally two arguments. Some of them actually take three. What does that mean? It means they take a subject, they require a subject and a complement to make a sentence, by the way. This whole business has to do with making sentences. It's syntax, so it's always about how to make a sentence. That's what syntax is. So, the word buy is an example of a transitive verb because Donald buys takes a subject, Donald, or any noun, he, mommy, whatever, and it takes a complement that is a noun. Nouns are very important, nouns and verbs. So Donald buys the newspaper, Donald buys candy, Donald buys some kind of a thing that could be bought. So it takes two arguments. Some verbs take three arguments. They take one subject, also a noun, and two noun complements. Donald shows the photos to Annie. And you say, well, that's not a noun phrase. That is true. That's not a noun phrase subject. That's complement. I'm sorry. That's prepositional phrase. They really should have shown this as Donald shows. You can say this a different way. Donald shows Annie the photos. You could have said it that way. Then it would have taken two nouns after it. The word put requires two complements, a noun phrase one and a prepositional phrase one. In that case, we're going to take prepositional phrase as a second argument. It's required. Donald puts the photos. That's not a sentence. Donald puts the photos in the cup. in the book. That becomes a sentence. It requires two arguments. Okay, so that's what they're talking about, argument structure complexity. Now there's, remember again what the purpose of this study was, the first aim, and I'm going to try to pull that up again. I had it up a second ago. I have to look at it since I have new memory, a vague memory, but not a good enough one to rely on. It says, as already stated somewhere, the first aim of the present study was to test whether children with SLI are limited in linguistic processing capacities compared to language-matched peers by looking at the effects of argument complexity on the omission of grammatical morphemes. Therefore, first of all, they are operationalizing argument complexity, the independent variable, by stating that we're talking about sentences that take no one argument, a subject, two arguments, a subject and a single complement, and three arguments, a subject, sentences that take three arguments, one subject, and two complements. Now, what they're going to do is take how they ultimately operationalize it, and the authors explain that is that they they come up with a list of sentences to present to the children that have these qualities to them. Following me? Now, they say that the effect on the omission of grammatical morphemes in sentence production, that's the dependent variable, that has to be operationalized. What do they mean, omission of grammatical morphemes? What morphemes are they looking at? That's a reasonable question. Okay, well, what did they mean again by morphemes? Morphemes that might be omitted. What they explained, the authors explain. Article and auxiliary verb omissions were adopted as dependent variables. They're very specific what the dependent variables are. They specifically focused on the omission of articles that went along with the nouns that were the arguments, and auxiliary verb omissions. An auxiliary verb refers to tense, things like will do this, or auxiliaries. Now, this study was conducted in French, so the auxiliary verb omissions refers to the French tense system. So articles in the French sentence system and auxiliary verbs were focused on. And very specifically, that is how the term, the dependent variable was operationalized, by the identification of article and auxiliary verb omissions. They stand as morpheme omissions. You see, the term morpheme was operationalized with reference to these two types of morphemes, articles and auxiliary verbs. And they identified those in the kids' production. Okay, in addition, by the way, to this particular dependent variable relationship, that is the relationship between argument structure and the omission of more grammatical morphemes by kids with learning SLI in comparison to typically achieving children, the two variables again being what? That's right, complexity of argument structure, independent, dependent, omission of morphemes. They have a second aim in this article and this research, and that is to evaluate the effect of length of sentence on omission of grammatical morphemes in children with SLI. And the reason they're looking at both morphemic complexity of argument structure and length is theoretical to try to understand what the underlying difficulty might be in learning disabilities or SLI, and that underlying situation is not operationalable. You can't see it. It's conceptual, you see. Now they describe, by the way, how the authors describe, by the way, how they control for length of sentence, how they operationalize the term length of sentence. And you'll see what they did was that they maintained the grammatical structure, the transitive and intransitive numbers of arguments, and coordinated essentially content categories. That is, put modifiers into the sentence to add to the length of the sentence by modifying nouns with adjectives, for example, without changing the argument structure of the sentence that they were studying. Take a look at that. Now, there's plenty in the article and all research really that is theoretical, and I just want to point out. Turn to one page that gets into that really reflects theory and requires a lot of thinking and reading and rereading to really get where the authors are coming from. They write, in order to make specific predictions about the effect of argument structure complexity, we used a sentence production model put forward by Bach and Levelt. And again, we cannot visually ever see sentence processing. We don't yet, I don't think, have the technology to neurologically identify what goes on in the brain as sentences are processed. So the authors are proposing a model, and that's purely chock full of constructs. That is, ideas they have about things that exist that they have never seen. So relevant kind of characteristics of the model are the following: that there are two temporally and functionally separate stages in sentence processing, argument structure processing. In the first stage, lexical items are selected, that is, words and morphemes are selected, and grammatical functions are assigned to them, subject, complement, following the argument structure specified by the verb. Later, at the positional level, grammatical morphemes, that is, not subjects that are not nouns that are subjects or complements, but rather other kinds of morphemes, articles, prepositions, etc., which are called for by the syntactic structure associated with the verb, are retrieved from a potentially separate store. Now, retrieve, the word retrieve and store, that means they are someplace in memory, stored somehow in a memory kind of thing, are retrieved and inserted and integrated within the prosodic structure. Again, there's some relationship to this statement and this kind of concept and what we're talking about in the 602 course as the verb relation categories and the non-verb relation coordinated categories. Similar kind of idea, although the idea of stores or memory retrieval is a bit different. Thus, the assignment of argument structure and morphosyntax occur in sequence, with argument structure being dealt with first. And then they go on about how that concept influences their hypothesis. That's a proposition. It goes to a proposition. These are the constructs. That there are two stages, several steps in the processing of a sentence, and that there are these components. Thus, the assignment of argument structure and morphosyntax occur in sequence, with argument structure being dealt with first, and then they talk about how that leads to a prediction. Because of slow processing at the argument structure level, morphosyntactic assignment ends up being adversely affected. That is, articles are going to be omitted, possibly, and maybe also helping verbs or auxiliary verbs. Processing will take too long, and they're going to start losing the rest of the little function words. Think about it. That's as far as I'm going to go with this right now, but what I'm trying to do here is follow up from our last session, in which we said, again, focused on the idea that every research article has a dependent and independent variable relationship someplace built into it, and it's that relationship that's being studied in the as part of the research program. It's our job as readers to, if we're going to understand the material, to separate out and identify what the independent variable is, that is the causal factor that's being studied and presumed by these researchers, and the effect, what is the behavior that is being influenced by that independent variable. Then we have to try to understand how the authors are conceptualizing each of these things and operationalizing them. And by operationalizing them, we mean specifying behaviors that can be observed and measured, and that stand for these concepts. In the case of the present study that we're reviewing, the conceptual things are the idea of argument structure and argument complexity, and the operationalization of that involves the number of subject complement components that comprise a sentence that contains a particular verb that requires one subject and no complement, one subject and one complement, one subject and two complements. The dependent variable morpheme structure, the morpheme omission, is operationalized how? By a count in terms, basically, of the numbers of articles and auxiliary verbs that are omitted by children as they reproduce sentences presented to them. Okay, that's as far as I'm going here. Now I'm going to turn to structural research and try to give you some sense of what that's all about.